This cool cat emerged on the scene in the 1990s, and it hates the idea that literature has a universal and timeless quality. This is because such an allegation undermines the cultural and historical factors which arguably influenced and moulded that piece of work. For example, if war poetry was analysed solely as poetry, the analysis would omit the purpose of that poetry, which is to portray the soldier's perspective of that very situation. Such a perspective offers more insight than merely propaganda, for example. But if it were to be universally analysed, this would be unregistered. What is also unfair about this universal standard is that it is not actually universal, but instead representative of a white Western agenda, which favours its own above African, Eastern, Oriental cultures, etc. Not only is the standard favourable to a Western agenda, but it also means that marginalised cultures would have been taught to appreciate the Western man's belief in universal standards in favour of the marginalised country's own voice and perspective. For this to be obliterated, the marginalised people must A. find their own voice, and B. recognise and reject the standards shoved upon them by other countries. Furthermore, if the European or Western agenda is adopted solely without question, perspectives of other countries can be seen as simply other and inferior. For example, the Oriental East could be seen as a projection of the West's negative aspects such as laziness, complacency, cruelty and others. But then, these can be portrayed as fascinating to the point of being unrealistic, the type of idea which made Othello fascinating to the English because he came from a country not fully understood at the time, glamorized as mystical amongst other labels, and held a strong status by English standards. Finally, the other culture can be seen to be grouped by their so-called makeup as a culture. This can be seen in Othello to the extent that he is seen to adopt an English manner, but ultimately he is African through and through, athletic, quick-tempered and inferior to the Englishman, to put it simply, objectified to the point of racism. So, to liberate a writer that is not European or Western, he must reject the guidelines forced upon him by the West, dominant culture, and find his own voice. But to find his own voice is a dilemma in itself. The budding writer wants to share his thoughts with the world, but if he writes in his language, only his people who share the language will be able to read it. However, if he writes in the Westerner's language, more people will register and analyse his viewpoints, but according to postcolonialism, this language that is not his own is tainted. To elaborate, if he writes in the dominant language, Western structures will then be supported instead of opposed. But if he has a dual identity, for example a Japanese heritage, but he grew up in America from the age of 8 and attended the University of Yale, can he then represent his culture because he's been moulded by the West? To answer this question as yes, a postcolonialist would argue that our writer must undergo 3 phases: adopt, adapt and adept. Adopt consists of a Japanese writer unquestionably accepting the ways and requirements of high Western literature, which will give his work as much universal validity as possible in relation to its merit. Then, our Japanese writer will adapt his subject matter to Western standards. That is to say that his topic has been adapted to a Western readership. Then finally, our newly established writer will write another piece which upholds his own culture's interests and cares little about pleasing the Western world. But because he is established, the Western world will want his work noted. If he wrote his second piece in Japanese, the West would want a translation. Finally, it must be stated that postcolonialism doesn't focus solely on the present and future, but also with regards to previous texts. For example, postcolonial critics are there to evaluate the past and offer a new balanced perspective of novels by analysing what previously shaped their words. Knowledge is the key here. The better subjective understanding we have of works, the better understanding we have of those works in their contemporary time and today's.